So you really got to figure out what are the most important initiatives in the company, and how do I build up, bottoms up, a budget, staffing, and process to accomplish what must be done to orient the company towards growth. And sales cures all ills. So as people are thinking about initiatives inside the company, you got to stack up everything you're doing and then say, okay, but how do I develop a hypothesis that's going to enable me to grow? Or maybe I've been flatlining and I got to do a step function. It's not about incremental kind of 10-20% growth. Like, my business isn't really doing great and I need it to do great. So you need to do 2 or 3 initiatives, and you got to fund those. And not necessarily with massive teams, but maybe a small, like, if it's your most important initiative, put your best people on it. And go do 1 or 2 things, and then starve the other initiatives.
Today, we're excited to have Zack Urlocker on the show. Zack's resume is frankly too long to fully read, but includes $4 billion plus exits spanning roles like COO at Duo Security and Zendesk, and EVP products at MySQL, and CEO at Gatsby. On top of that, he's also been a board member and advisor to numerous startups spanning the enterprise software ecosystem. And in this episode, we're going to cover as many scaling tips as we can get out of Zack for founders and teams early in their journey. So welcome to the show, Zack.
Thanks. Happy to be here. And I've listened to quite a few episodes of the podcast, and I found it to be really interesting.
Well, thank you for listening, and also, we will link to your Substack in the show notes. But thank you so much for what you're writing and sharing for the founders out there. I highly recommend everyone to subscribe to Build to Scale. So, but to kick things off, you have helped numerous incredible companies scale. It's a little mind-boggling to talk about. But how would you describe what has made you successful in these various companies?
Well, every company is different, and I've been fortunate to be part of some very large industry trends and worked with a lot of talented founders and executives. But I would say if there's one skill that I think is super valuable, it's being able to identify customer patterns and then taking action to make those even more effective. Not everybody has those skills. Not every executive needs them, but you want to have somebody on the executive team who's able to kind of see around corners a little bit to see what are the actual patterns. And it's not just technology trends. It's understanding how will people adopt the technology and what are the obstacles in their way. And if you're able to clear those obstacles and help customers consume new technologies, that can drive a lot of growth.
And I think you actually wrote a post about seeing those patterns, but is that something that you are intentionally looking for from the moment you join a new company? You're just like, okay, let me figure out what those patterns are and how I can scale those. Is that the right way to think about it, or how would you describe it?
Well, when I've joined companies, I think the key things that I've seen in retrospect, looking back across them, is these were companies addressing very large markets. So MySQL and databases, Duo Security in cybersecurity, et cetera. And they were large markets, and the technologies were disruptive, meaning it was changing the nature of consumption, typically a bottoms-up disruption. As defined by Clayton Christensen. So not just, hey, new cool features, but actually truly enabling new people to enter into the market. And maybe a third thing that really shouldn't be overlooked is the fact that customers loved those products. MySQL, Zendesk, Duo Security, they didn't just like them, they loved them, and they became raving fans. And that was something that, in retrospect, is hugely valuable. If you can figure out a way to really make people excited about the product because it solved a hard problem that they weren't going to solve otherwise.
That seems like maybe the common thread is that disruptive technology, that customer love. But one thing that's wild to me is that you have databases, application SaaS, security, front-end tooling, There's pretty much no persona, no buyer that's the same in any of those use cases. Was that something that you intentionally did, or was it much more just, hey, I found a team that I'm very excited about, a product that I'm very excited about, and I want to join?
No, that was very much by design. I always wanted to take on new roles that were more different than more like what I had done in the past. And so, as an example, after MySQL, I got calls to be COO or CEO of every open source database company around. And after 5 years of being in that space, I wanted to be somewhere different. There's a certain amount of craziness in open source, or at least at the time. And so, I did meet with those companies and give them advice. And I was a mentor on things like pricing and how to build a scalable open source model and stuff, and share the lessons we learned at MySQL. But I like the idea of doing something a little bit different. Zendesk was part of that first wave of SaaS companies. And I think, again, when there's a new phenomena happening, I think that's super important. And you can apply some lessons across different areas, but it's like, I'm not going in and saying I have a playbook and I'm going to apply the MySQL playbook to Zendesk, or the Zendesk playbook to Duo Security, or where I'm an advisor or something. But I think when you've seen a lot of different industries and different consumption models, pricing models, adoption models, then you get pretty agile about thinking of new ways to apply techniques.
Normally I don't do this, but I want to really just kind of almost walk through your resume, because I feel like so many experiences at each and every different time. And so I want to start actually with Borland Software, where, you had to actually experience a turnaround scenario. So just describe what you had to do there. What were your biggest learnings, or what were some anecdotes from that time of going through what seemed like a turbulent period?
Yeah, it was definitely a tough situation. Borland was a great company, a very highly innovative culture, not just in technology and products, but also in the marketing. They really pioneered a lot of what became very aggressive marketing techniques, email techniques, et cetera. And I got to work with a guy named Anders Heilsberg, and he's one of the top 10 programmers in the world. That's not my view. That's other people's. He created Turbo Pascal, Delphi, C#, .NET, TypeScript,
wow.
et cetera.
Okay.
And, he's at Microsoft now, and he's just a terrific programmer. So that helped me develop an appreciation for technical talent. And it wasn't just Anders. There was a lot of great talent at Borland. But we were going through a rough time. And I remember at some stage, the company was trying to get into a new era of client-server computing. That was the new hot thing. And the execs were looking around, and we were looking around saying, okay, which technology can help us get the client-server? Well, it wasn't going to be C++, because that was too complicated. It wasn't going to be Paradox or DBase. Those were too limited. And so I kind of looked around, and I went to Anders and Gary Wizen, the engineering manager I worked with, and I said, guys, it's got to be us. Like, we have to do this for the company. And we didn't know anything about client server. We didn't know anything about database technology or any of that. But I knew it was important for the company. So Anders, Gary, Chuck, Jasky, other guys, they trusted me. When I put up our hand, I said, we will do this. And we helped create Delphi. It took a little longer than we expected. It took about 2 years to get to market. We launched it February 14th, 1995. It's Valentine's Day. There we were in San Francisco at Moscone Center. There was a conference going on, about 900 programmers, presumably who couldn't get a date on that night. But it became a really strong product. Its first year revenues were 70 million, which is about equivalent to 100 million today's dollars. And it really saved the company. And it's because we saw this trend, and we said, we can't just do one more version of what we'd done before. We have to do something radically different. And it really enabled growth across the industry. And that was something that, it was all about listening to the customers. And, but we also felt that, like, this is a great product. Like, if we were out there in the market building applications, this is the tool that we wanted to use. It just had such good performance. really unlocked a lot of value for a lot of our customers.
I want to ask a little bit more around there. So when you say listening to customers, I mean, were customers actually telling you, hey, this is what we need? Or was it more of you guys intuiting, okay, this seems like the customers are saying they have this pain point and this would solve the pain point? And then the other question on that would be, how did you rally the company behind it?
Well, initially we were kind of an underground project, that Philippe Kahn, the founder, had kind of given us permission to fly under the radar for a period of time, during which there were like layoffs and stuff like that. And the team was very small. I mean, it was initially like half a dozen people, and it grew over time. But I went out to customers. I remember flying out to Grand Rapids and other cities and meeting Amway or these customers, those customers, all kinds of people, and just asking them. We didn't tell them anything about what we were building. I just listened, and I had a series of questions, 8 or 10 questions on a piece of paper, and I would try to ask the same questions in every case and understand, about their last project, typically their last client server project. What went well? What didn't go well? What were the surprises? Where did you run into problems? And after doing this about 8 or 10 times, I started to see a pattern emerge, which is people were using these 4th generation tools at the time, SQL windows and stuff like that. And those products always ran out of gas. They could make easy things easy, but hard things, you kind of hit the wall and you couldn't go any further. And that kind of became the mantra for Delphi, was because it was native code compiled, high performance, et cetera, it would scale to very large problems and stuff like that. And that became the basis of leading the company. And initially it was just leading our team, and meeting with people. These customers gave me and Gary and Anders the conviction that this was a big market opportunity for client server, and we couldn't back down from it. And, of course, as we were building this technology, there were times where, the first iteration of building the database access code, a developer left because, it was a hard time for the company. He was recruited probably to Microsoft. Anders looks under the hood and it's like, oh my God, this code is terrible. We have to start all over from scratch. That's why it took us longer. And at that time, I think every single person from the team came to me at some point in my office and said, okay, I get that client server is really important, but look, it's going to take us too long. Why don't we just do the thing we did before? Why don't we just release the desktop version? And I drew this graph and I said, look, the reason we're doing this is initially the desktop sales will be higher, but client server growth will outstrip that. And we have to do that for the company. And, I hope that's true. I don't know that it's true. But eventually it did turn out that way, that the client server revenues eclipsed what we're doing on the desktop. And that was really a big strategic bet. Now, as we started to gather steam, it started to attract the attention of executives in the company. And I remember meeting with one executive and she kind of learned what we're doing. And they said, oh, this is just a bunch of developer stuff. I thought it was something really exciting. And it's like, no, it is exciting.
That is exciting.
But it was really when Delphi became a success that people believed in it. I think Philippe and a couple of other execs believed in it, but there was a lot of skepticism. And I was trying to grow the team. And I remember trying to get people to join our team, and people just weren't that interested in it because it was a new, scary thing.
Yeah. Well, that's I feel like there's so many hardships in there, but also it ended up working out. But you then went on to join Active Software, which started your scaling of the 6-100 million ARR journey that you've had multiple times. That IPO'd in 1999 and ended up being acquired by WebMethods. But describe the craziness of the .com bubble at that time.
Yeah, there were a lot of BS companies out there at the time, getting eyeballs and just burning a lot of investor money. Active was not that kind of company. We were a real company, and we were building really sophisticated enterprise middleware for doing integration, and a category called EAI, Enterprise Application Integration, basically helping people connect their people system with SAP, with Oracle, and a whole bunch of legacy stuff today. And we had competitors, people who were really had a much higher burn rate, spending like crazy. And I remember one of our board members, Kevin Compton, from Kleiner Perkins, he used to caution us and say, look, just because they're out spending like drunken sailors, that doesn't mean that's what we need to do. So we stayed the course. And, I was the youngest executive in active software at that time, so I was in my mid 30s. Most of the other people were in their 40s. So it was a fairly mature company in a lot of ways. It wasn't this .com craziness. And by the time we got to our IPO, we were doing about 100 million in bookings, and we were cash flow positive or break even. So, but during that time, sometimes the stock after our IPO, it would move $10 or $20 a day. And you're like, what the heck? And it's, Jim Green, our CEO, would remind us, hey, it's not because we got smarter yesterday. It's just the market. Don't pay too much attention to it. And, I remember at the time, my wife and I had dinner with a bunch of ex-Borland colleagues down to Santa Cruz. And, there's 12 or 14 people, and everybody was at a hot new startup that either had done an IPO or was about to IPO. And on the drive home, I said to my wife, look, we can't all be winners. Like it doesn't make sense that everyone here is in a phenomenal company that's going to change the world. It can't be true. And that was really a sign of the bubble. And things did unravel in the following year. We had a real business at Active Software, so we merged in with Web Methods. They were a East Coast company out of Fairfax, Virginia, doing kind of B2B middleware, and maybe a little bit more .com than we were, in that they were a lot of younger, first-time executives. And I remember Philip Merrick, who was the CEO, when we first met to join the companies together, he said, Zach, if you want to maintain the active brand and just keep that, we'll do that. And I think in his mind, he was trying to make a concession so that our team would be excited to join or whatever. And I said, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. Like, okay, yeah, we're 100 million and they were close to that same revenue. But, we can only afford to have one brand, and the brand is Web Methods. And we've got to all move in the same direction. So, but they did a really good job on the integration, from a technical perspective, from a cultural perspective with employees, et cetera. And, went on to be fairly successful.
Well, so from there, you found your way to MySQL, and this is actually how I met you and came across you, was actually through Martin Mikos. And what's interesting, I think, for me to specifically around MySQL is, your title there actually was you ran marketing and engineering. And, normally I see engineering, right? I normally don't see engineering and marketing together. So, I mean, why was that the case? Why did you run both functions? How did that even work together?
Well, it began when I first joined the company, and I told Martin, I said, look, whenever we get to the end of this journey, whatever it is, if I'm still just running marketing, then from my point of view as an executive, I've failed. I really want to learn and take on some new things as we go. And a few years into it, it was December. We just had a very successful MySQL conference in San Jose. And, very, very hectic time, very busy. We had a lot of developers. We were primarily a remote organization, one of the first, but we had a lot of developers and support people in town. And it was Thursday, the conference was over, and I was about to walk into Martin's office, or I was walking into Martin's office, and I was basically going to ask for Friday off so I could go recuperate, because everybody had burned a lot of hours. And before I got to ask him, he said, I'm letting the VP of engineering go. Will you run engineering for me? And I'm
okay.
Like, okay, I guess I'm not taking Friday off. And I'd never run engineering. I'd never worked as an engineer, but, I have a computer science background. I'd worked with a lot of programmers and been very close to it through product management. but this was going to be a difficult challenge. And, you know, when the CEO asked the head of marketing to run engineering, like, you know, things aren't in great shape, right? So this wasn't plan B, this was plan C. You know, there had been another plan in place, but that didn't work out. And so this was my opportunity to go fix things. And it was a difficult time for me personally. My mother had late stage cancer, and my parents were in Florida. And again, we were a remote organization, so I could travel out there, which was good. But I had to really immerse myself into engineering, starting that day, meeting with as many of the engineers as I could who happened to be in Cupertino at that time. And then I got on the road, traveling out to Sweden, Germany, Finland, Russia, where we had groups of engineers that I could meet with. And, you know, when all else fails, you go back to try to understand the customers and the organizational structure and apply a good structure to so you can get out of your own way and start solving the problems that customers have been telling you about. And so I had to really quickly immerse myself, figure out who could I trust that they could get things done, who was maybe out there for egotistical reasons, trying to build their empires, or maybe had opinions, but they weren't grounded in reality, et cetera. And kind of over time, rebuild the engineering organization into a much more well-functioning situation. And there had been quality issues with MySQL. That's why the prior VP was let go. And when I looked under the hood, you know, there were lots of structural problems in engineering, organizational problems. You know, you had teams that were under-resourced or resources borrowed from this team to that team. And so they weren't hitting their dates because they were asked to do something else, and just trying to make it much more rational and understandable, and then get people focused on a few initiatives. And also cutting our losses in some areas where there were some technical bets that weren't going to pay off, and then figuring out, okay, what bets can we make where it's not my opinion that this is going to work, it's my trust in the engineers and the engineering managers that they see how they can solve a certain problem and that they're actually confident of it. And this was really about empowering people and kind of pushing decision-making down to engineers and engineering managers who could figure out what were the right technical bets to make this happen.
But I mean, kind of how do you just go about doing that? I understand there's maybe no one answer, but did you spend more time with ICs, for example, to kind of see what they were saying and what they thought problems were? Did you try and identify key individuals that everyone respected and then be like, okay, those are going to be my Sherpas essentially, and I'm going to empower them and build around them? Like, I just, how tactically do you go about doing that?
Well, the organization wasn't that big in those days. You know, it was probably like 40 or 50 engineers all in. And so ultimately I was able to meet with probably 95% of them in person. And this was pre-Zoom, you know, so, you know, it was IRC, it was Skype, voice only, those kind of things. But, you know, I took advantage of where we could meet multiple people together, try to meet them. And then, it was all of that. You know, you're trying to figure out like what are the problems? What are the problems they see? And then again, finding patterns and figuring out, okay, I've heard this problem from this person, this problem, this, okay, this seems to be a problem. Who has a vision for how to solve the problem? And, you know, sometimes when there's a change in leadership or somebody prominent leaves an organization, you see other people step up to provide leadership. And so I was very much focusing on those things. And also just part of the job as an executive is to reduce the chaos and noise for the people trying to get their jobs done. And, you know, mostly people at the front lines know what needs to be done. And so you really have to have that ability to listen and figure out who is oriented towards solving customer problems and who's kind of busy with other stuff that doesn't matter. And how did they fall into that trap? And can you fix them and redeem them? Or do you have to just move them out? And, it's a little bit of both. Mostly it was identifying things that, as an example, MySQL didn't have backup capabilities at this time. There's kind of a weakness in the product. And I remember going into the board meeting, and Martin said, "Hey, this is your first board meeting as the VP of engineering, so let loose and tell them all the bad news. Get it out there up front." And I said, "Hey, one of the challenges, we don't have backup facilities. We've been working on this for over 2 years, and it hasn't gotten anywhere." And Monty, the co-founder, says, "No, we've been working on it for 4 years." Great.
That's even better, yeah.
Yeah, even better. So then it's saying, look, if we say it's important, building a new backup capability in the company, then we must allocate the resources to do it. And we can't jerk those teams around and then move them off it after 4 weeks, because you're never going to get it finished if you keep context switching on people. So it was identifying a series of technical bets or product features or whatever, and then making sure that they were staffed, and then looking at it and saying, is this reasonable? Like, can we actually do this? And you can't have 5 number one priorities. And you can't go to engineers and say, I know you need a team of 10 people. I'm going to give you 2 half-time. Like, right. Let's be honest. And if something isn't going to get engineering staff or resources, then let's be clear about that. And sometimes you have to say, look, there's a thing over here. It's going into a mode of benign neglect. We're all going to decide that together we've decided we're not going to focus on this. So I absolve you of worrying about it. And then you have to follow up as an engineering leader. You have to follow up and make sure that the teams are doing the things that they agreed to do. And sometimes that means going back to them and say, hey, I know you really want to work on this, but we already agreed this can't happen. So you need to wrap that up this week or whatever, and really make sure that the resources are moving on the right in the right direction together. And then you got to make sure those are the right things for product and sales and marketing. But I mean, it was a pretty intense year, I'll be clear.
I mean, I can imagine, to say the least. But looking back now, do you actually think that there is some sort of coupling between engineering and marketing? Because I mean, those are, nobody thinks about those as being organized under the same leader. I've never seen that before. I've never seen that besides you, right? But would you actually say, hey, there are some things that overlap in ways that people wouldn't understand?
A little bit, but I'm not a conventional marketing person. I'm really more of a product person. That's my early career was in product management. And so even when I ran marketing in companies, I kind of told people up front, look, I don't really care about the logo or the colors or whatever, but I care about we're building the right thing for customers and then telling that story. And what I would say is in early stage to medium stage technology companies, your product strategy is your company strategy. So in that sense, like what you build from engineering and product really defines what it is you can go market. Not necessarily how you market, but it certainly has influences there. And for example, when you're marketing to developers, it's all about skills acquisition and enabling people to take on new jobs, improve their resume, et cetera. And you have to understand those things. But, I don't think most VPs of marketing or CMOs would really be interested or equipped to run engineering. It is a very different discipline.
Yeah, that makes sense, and what I would have expected to hear. But just wanted to ask you that. This was one of your other many, kind of 5 million ARR to 100 plus journeys. And so, I think what's so cool about the MySQL story is all the open source practices that were being codified, the positioning against huge incumbents that were doing well in the market as well at the time. And so, what learnings did you pull from that time, or what specific anecdotes do you have on really kind of helping scale the business through that journey?
Sure. We were very conscious of the fact that this was a disruptive playbook. And Martin Mikos kind of recognized that maybe better than anyone. And one of the most important things was to really understand the dynamic of the market. We had a lot of free users because it's open source, but we had to figure out a way to identify who is actually going to pay us money. So this is where the pattern matching thoughtfulness comes into play. And we identified different segments where people would pay. For example, OEM customers who were looking for a specific kind of embedded database, had to be small footprint, low cost, high efficiency, x86, Windows or Linux, mostly Windows at this time. And we had to really identify what was it that made MySQL helpful for those people, and what was the content people were looking for in those cases. And so we'd create content, a guide to embedded databases, how to evaluate MySQL, blah, blah, blah. But there was also a unique thing in the industry at this time, which was there were few companies or products as disliked by their customers as Oracle or SQL Server at that time. And, SQL Server is a great product today, and Oracle's certainly a formidable company. But, Oracle had this approach of kind of,
stuffing it down your throat. Yeah.
Screw the customer at every turn, raise the prices, change the licensing schemes, et cetera. And for some reason, SQL Server had gone about 5 years without any meaningful updates at this time. And so there was also the backdrop, a trend here, which was the World Wide Web was emerging during this time. And oddly enough, the big vendors out there, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, they didn't care about what was going on the web. The web was sort of like static HTML. It was, you had a webmaster. They had some kind of, Intel box running in a closet. Who cared? Nobody cared. And what happened was there was this evolution going from static HTML and CSS to, hey, I need to add some dynamic functionality. How do you do that? Well, you need a database. What's a database? Just go download MySQL. And so our play during this period was to be the best web database. And nobody cared about that. And so we built bindings for PHP, Perl, Python, et cetera. So many of these were built in the open source community, and then we would hire the best, the developers behind the best version and continue to maintain them, et cetera. But that was kind of our growth trajectory. And for a few years, we were kind of embarrassed of, the web companies using MySQL. It's, okay, Craigslist, okay, that's cute. Craigslist wasn't a big thing. Or Yahoo is using it. Okay, Yahoo's kind of cool, but how many times can we talk about this? And we thought we really need SAP and Oracle and these kind of companies to legitimize what we're doing. And then eventually we realized, no, actually the web is the big dominant trend. So we really focused on that and this emerging technology. And we also were good at communicating to the entire market about our product strategy. So even though we had, about a 1%, maybe 1.1% conversion rate of free users to paid customers, that's kind of typical in open source. It was enough for us to build a $100 million business around it because databases are really widely used. But you had to distinguish between the people who were hobbyists or students or startups without budget from those like, okay, American Airlines is using us now. Okay, that's pretty serious. They're willing to pay extra to have something that is higher availability. It's not going to go down. There's not going to be problems or whatever. So it was really about focusing on identifying who is in a situation where if bad things happened, they wouldn't be happy and they're willing to pay us to have some additional capabilities around it. What eventually became MySQL Enterprise with a subscription offering, kind of what we would now call open core model.
So I have to ask you about the topic that everyone seems to have very strong opinions on, which is remote versus in person, right? I mean, I think even Zoom, which many would say helped bring about this remote era with during COVID. They actually just announced that they're going in person. So during that time, how did you're scaling the company? It's growing very rapidly. You're doing this all remote. You mentioned you have kind of Skype. It's not the best at that point in time. You've got IRC, right? You're trying to use these things like. What did you do to make the team effective while being remote?
It was a lot of things. And partly it was a recognition that clear recognition, you had to bring people together about every 6 months. Not necessarily the entire company. In the early days, it might be the entire company. But, things work better after you've met people face to face. That's why, like when I took on engineering, I got out on the road to meet people, to break bread with people, to share beers or whatever, so that you can build that trust and esprit de corps face to face. Now, even though we were 95% remote, when I joined, Martin said, "Hey, you can hire people anywhere you want." I said, "Great, I'm hiring them in Cupertino." And so the first few hires that I made in marketing were people that were in the Bay Area, because there's a lot of talent there. And in quite a few people I had worked with previously, from Borland or elsewhere, who understood developer marketing. And so we did have a small office in Cupertino. There were no developers there. But what we basically said over time established was there's a once annual all hands meeting. Everybody gets together, and it's a working meeting. There's some fun things in the evenings, but you're there to work side by side, work through some difficult problems, sometimes just programming side by side, or all in a big room. But we also looked for having sales kickoffs, twice a year instead of just once a year. So every 6 months, you'd pull the entire sales organization together. And when you pulled sales together, you'd bring in adjacent groups, product, marketing people would be in the same meetings, so they would hear the same issues from customers. The support team would gather, in Bulgaria or other locations, low-cost regions typically, and they would have a couple of engineers take place or be part of that. When engineering gathered, product people would be there, maybe a couple of marketing people. So what you want to do is make sure that when you pull people together, you're there to address the hard issues. But you've also got adjacent people so that you ensure high collaboration. So you don't create this us versus them mentality, like sales bitching that they can't get the product they need. Okay, well, let's have the product people in the room. There'll be a lot less bitching, and there'll be a lot more, how can we work on this together? And I think there was a strength in the MySQL management team, which was we were all very collaborative and had tremendous respect for all the functions in the organization. And this is something I see a lot. You kind of alluded to marketing and engineering being at odds sometimes. Certainly there's a low bar for collaboration in a lot of tech companies. And, early in my career, I just made the decision, like, we're not going to operate like that. We're going to operate together and figure out how to find common things so that we can achieve better results together. You can usually find that unifying vision around customers.
Okay.
And there's a certain amount of BS. This is a tangent. There's a certain amount of BS in Silicon Valley that comes from the Steve Jobs school of thinking. Customers don't know what they want, and that kind of stuff. But I actually think customers very much understand the problems they have, particularly in a B2B world. And if you're able to solve those problems, they're going to pay you. They're very straightforward about that. Consumer marketing is a little bit trickier, I would say.
Yeah. I've heard that same terminology from you now in every answer. I went out, I met customers. I mean, even when you took over engineering, I went out and met customers. Like, that seems to be what drives everything. What you're saying, hey, if we orient the org around the customer feedback, then that's kind of the shared point of collaboration. That's the shared point of understanding. And seems like maybe that helps solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. It's sort of crazy, how often this doesn't happen in companies. As companies grow, execs get really kind of siloed off from the real world, and they might sell to customers, but they aren't necessarily listening to customers. And what I found is early in my career as a product manager, like if you knew what was happening with customers, like you got a seat at the table. You could influence the roadmap, the product strategy, you name it, because you knew more than a lot of other people did about what was really going to happen. And you also develop that conviction that says, hey, I've talked to 10 customers. I looked them in the eyes. I know that this is going to happen. That it's not like a speculative bet. It's not my opinion. It's the opinion of the customers. And I've seen how transformative that can be on the culture of a company. Like at Duo Security, I remember Lisa Paul ran customer success. I said, hey, I want you to bring in a customer to the next all hands meeting. And she brought in a customer. He came in with a list of all the things he loved about Duo. And then he had another list, all the things that we needed to fix. And you could see, this is in an hour, you could see engineers taking notes and writing things down. And for a long time afterwards, people would say, hey, remember when that guy from Kelly Systems came and he said, boom, 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 boom. And it influenced their thinking. And we got really good about thinking about customer personas and doing that kind of research. At Duo, I think, was particularly good at this. And, again, it's not about my opinion or your opinion or the VP of this or that. It's about, hey, we actually talked to the customers. We hoped it would be this, but it turned out to be this. Like, I'd rather just know than, I don't need to be right. I just need to know, what is the reality with customers.
So moving into Zendesk, which, it's hilarious. You go from databases and dev tools to application SaaS, right? But you're joining at the similar stage, different personas, different buyers, different, so many things are different. What learnings did you take from your time at MySQL, Active Software, Borland, that helped you kind of at Zendesk, or was it kind of completely new playbook, learn everything from scratch all over again?
There was a lot of new stuff for me to learn. I ran sales for the first time as COO. Sales was one guy, Matt Van Loan, and he's a good guy, but he didn't really know how to sell, and we didn't really equip him to sell. So we had to reorient marketing around helping sales, and sales to put up their hands, say, hey, I need leads, those sort of things. It was an interesting time, though, because we were selling to kind of the lowest of the low in organizations. If you think of a lot of our early customers were tech companies, and a lot of tech companies, they're either engineering led or they're sales led. And then next down, maybe marketing is the next rung down in the organization, and then product or whatever, and then the janitorial staff, and if there's a cafeteria, the cafeteria staff, and then customer support. They're really a neglected group. And as a result, we were able to just cater to their needs and do something that made their life better. And the life of a customer service rep, it's just chaos. All day long, people are telling you their problems, and they're yelling at you, and they're sending emails, and I didn't get this and I didn't get that. And we were able to make their lives a little bit more manageable, and they really appreciate it. But one of the things that was interesting about Zendesk was it was very much a tactical purchase. So it's not like a database where it's strategic and the CTO needs to be involved and you're going to read Gartner reports or whatever. Nobody gives a hoot what customer service software you buy. The CEO is just like, well, just don't spend more than X. So typically It was the frontline manager or maybe a director of customer service who makes the decision. And so we had to really orient everything around the trial experience. And unlike MySQL, which is sort of a freemium model, open source, and pay if you want these other things, Zendesk was just a 30-day free trial experience. Nobody wants to set up a Zendesk as a hobby. It's just not a thing, right? So we just oriented towards optimizing that trial experience and getting people into the product, using it, and figuring out what are the things that predict whether they're actually going to buy, and how do we help them through that trial process. But 99% of the revenue came through that kind of trial process, and it was a very, very predictable business. You just had to keep growing the funnel at the top, create new content, help people do a good job. So in that regard, similar to other content type marketing things. But it was a really interesting time. And, before I joined, or right when I joined, I kind of asked Mikkel, the CEO, and Adrian, the VP of engineering, I said, hey, you guys got to give me one thing. I need an enterprise product so that we can raise the price from, I think it was $49 a month to $99 a month, so that we can actually afford to hire an inside sales team. Because at the time, like, the annual deal size at Zendesk was $748.
Wow.
Annually.
Oh my God.
Annually.
Crazy.
So, I mean, we had a lot of customers and a lot of tech customers, but, and some of those were like Twitter, Airbnb, those were companies that were growing very rapidly, but we had to cater to bigger needs very, very quickly. And I remember it was pretty daunting sometimes. I'd go meet with, support guy at Box or Airbnb, these companies, and they'd say like, hey, we need this, we need this, we need this. And these were experienced executives who'd maybe joined second wave inside those companies because they were growing rapidly. And then they say, hey, I'm not the first person to tell you this, am I? Like, what the? And I'm, oh, no. It's on our roadmap, and then I'd get back to the office and I'd like, hey, we need to add this to the roadmap. Yeah. So we were just trying to stay ahead of it. And, I'd go out and meet customers. I remember any excuse I'd say to sales reps, if you could get me 3 meetings in a city, I'll go there. I don't care if it's a $500 a year deal or $5,000 or $50,000. We didn't have $50,000 deals then, but we got there eventually. And I remember going out to the East Coast for a wedding, and my idea of fun is like, I'm going to go cram in a bunch of customer meetings while I'm out there. But I would share those back on our internal system. It was, again, pre-Slack, so it was Yammer, and say, hey, I'm meeting with this customer, and here's the things they liked, and here's the other things. And I want to create that awareness in the company about, developers love to hear that their feature helped close a deal or the customers like it. So let's give them visibility and kudos and thank yous. But let's also shine a light on, hey, they've run into this problem or that problem. And, there's patterns you'd see. People don't necessarily keep up on all your features. There's a perception lag, 6 to 9 months. You may have already addressed something, but it's going to take a while for people to really be up to date on everything that you've done. They're not hanging off every newsletter we've written. You got to really communicate and over communicate a lot about the capabilities you're building and the roadmap and stuff. It was a tremendously fun time, though.
In terms of that pricing you mentioned, the 700, 750 or whatever average sales price, was that simply because you just weren't asking for enough? Because now that would be, Zendesk is $1 million, type deals. I guess how quickly did that change from that price point to, something in the tens of thousands?
Well, it was growing. And again, we had if you remember back in the day, Groupon was a pretty big company, and they had started basically the founder started using Zendesk on a weekend and then just rolled it out to the entire company. And they were growing I swear, 20 to 50x year over year. And I'd travel out to Chicago and be in their offices, and you just see kind of a warehouse size office with everybody running Zendesk. You can see the green of the screen. And I'd send that back to people and hey, this is serious. We got to fix their issues, because they're finding all kinds of scale problems dealing with what they're dealing with.
Do you think that the price point could have been earlier on much more aggressively set, or was
Probably
it?
Not. No.
Okay.
Zendesk was, again, this was very much a disruptive model, disrupting from the bottom, selling to the underserved, people who would not buy traditional solutions from Oracle or Right Now or other Siebel, other vendors who are in this category. So we actually had to be pretty low priced. There had to be an entry point to get people in. And we were also selling very much to small organizations. It's kind of like once you got to a 5-person support team, you needed a tool. You couldn't just be doing this with a shared inbox or something. That was going to be a disaster. So over time, we raised our ASP every quarter. Like we knew it was going to go up, and it went up because we had more enterprise functionality where we doubled the price, or because we had more seats that we're selling. And over time, we also found reasons to enable people to consume more. Like we basically said, look, there's unlimited such and such if you buy the enterprise version, or there's more advanced reporting, et cetera. So it was a good strategy in the early days to start at the low end of the market and go for volume because, it was a startup. It was pretty cost efficient and, could have been cash flow positive. I mean, it was cash flow positive very early on, actually. Surprisingly quickly. So I think it was a good strategy, but we were also conscious of the fact that we didn't want to be like the thing you start on and then you move off it. A lot of companies start on QuickBooks, but by the time they get to IPO, they're kind of ashamed of it, so they move to something else. And part of the argument that I made to the executive team and the founders was, we've got to give people a trajectory where they see that they can stay with Zendesk as long as they grow. And there was some, opposition to going to the enterprise. Not real opposition, but like Mikkel just was not a fan of enterprise selling and enterprise customers. It's just, he had done that earlier in his career and he just didn't like it. He likes selling to individuals and influencing their lives. But I remember Alex and Morton, two of the technical co-founders, I was saying, hey, we're going to move to the enterprise. And they're like, does that mean we have to be boring now? And like, no, like the whole Zendesk, the Buddha with the headphones, like that kind of marketing that we did, like that actually works very well with enterprise customers. Instead of the cliched, smiling people on headsets, like, look, tech support people, customer service people, they're never smiling. They're getting yelled at. They have nothing to smile about. The only time they smile is when their day's over. So we were trying to communicate much more of a real experience that was authentic, that made it work. And then over time, yes, we absolutely got to those larger deals and had more enterprise features. And SaaS also became something that was more accepted. Because we knew early on, like we would qualify customers and like, what other SaaS software are you implementing? And if the answer was none, it's like, well, we're not going to be your first thing.
Right. Yeah.
Like it's just too hard a process. But if they had Salesforce and maybe HubSpot or Box or Dropbox, then it's like, okay, look, you understand, you're not afraid of the cloud. You understand you can move your customer data there, et cetera.
That makes sense. So from there, you jumped into security because why not? Just let's move into something new again. And so that was, you were COO of Duo Security. And I think what's interesting is actually just hearing about what you were talking about Zendesk. Now I think it's easy to think about Zendesk as a very top-down sort of play, but it sounds like actually it was sort of much more end user adopted, or at least something that was more serving the end user. And I think that naturally parallels over to Duo, where that was an end user could pick up and start using it for MFA and so on and so forth. So I guess one was that parallel something that got you comfortable with making the shift, and then what were some of your learnings from your time at Duo?
So it was absolutely a conscious decision on my part to focus on cybersecurity. I felt that as the web became more pervasive in our business lives and our personal lives, that security was super important. So I actually made the decision to go figure out how to get myself into the security industry. And I'd wrapped up things at Zendesk, and my wife is from Michigan, and we moved to Michigan. And I'd met with Doug Song, the founder, and I started just being an advisor to him and to some of the executive team there, the CFO, Paul DiMarzo, and others. And interesting, one of the things I do is whenever I talk to companies or I start working with them, I always test out the service. I call up, I I pretend to be a customer, or not pretend, but I sign up for the trial process and I see what happens. Did they respond to me, et cetera? I do some research. I talk to their prospects, or I talk to customers and say, hey, what do you think of this company, et cetera? And what I found was, again, very much like Zendesk or MySQL, people who used it really, really loved it. And of course, if I come to you and say, hey, I want to roll out a new security capability, you're like, oh my God, save me now.
Yeah,
like,
how long will this take? Oh,
yeah. How much pain and suffering is there going to be? And then you show them Duo on your phone and you're like, oh, that's cool. Show me again. Hey, I just clicked the green box. Well, that's amazing. That's fun. It feels like a positive thing. So, and what I didn't know initially as I was joining was Peter Baker, the director of the creative marketing, he was a huge fan of Zendesk. So he actually, like one of the secret lessons of Duo and Zendesk was we took B2C marketing techniques and applied it to a B2B scenario. And so it really was a very powerful mechanism. Pete, he forged his own path, but he was very conscious of these things. Pete actually created the brand around Duo. It was originally called SIO Security, and he was basically a huge creative influence in the company's positioning and building the whole brand awareness. And Duo was a good company. It was well run. The founders, Doug and John, really saw a potential of this 2FA. John will kind of joke. He say we were kind of embarrassed in the early days, like. Two-factor authentication is not the most highfalutin security. It's pretty basic. It had been around for 10, 20 years, but the new thing was putting it on a mobile device as opposed to one of those RSA tokens and stuff. But it was really a disruptive model in that we were providing security to people who might otherwise not have any security in place. They were not going to go buy a suite from McAfee or Symantec or RSA. It was just too complicated. They didn't have the staff. Most of it was bought by network engineers to go secure a specific system or server. And it really had fantastic trial adoption, product-led growth. So there was some similarities with Zendesk, but it was great. I'd moved to Michigan, and they were located in Ann Arbor, and really great Midwestern values. People were very loyal to the company. They didn't jump ship and go down the street to change jobs just for an extra 5K or 10K or stuff. And it was very much a high velocity model. But there again, we also had to look for patterns. And I remember in the early days when I joined, I brought in some new execs. Jim Sibb, who worked for me at Zendesk, he ran sales, and Jeff Wiss ran marketing, and hired a new guy, Ash Devada, who ran product. And we didn't have a lot going on. Jim had cut loose a couple of the enterprise sales reps, and we had this opportunity that showed up. It was a healthcare system on the East Coast, and they said, hey, there's this new legislation that says for electronic prescription of controlled substances, you need to do 2FA. And the way legislation is written, it's pretty generic, it's very vague. They said, we read the legislation. We think Duo would do the trick for us, but I need you to integrate with Epic Systems.
Oh, God.
Epic Systems. I've kind of heard of this. And it's this massive kind of enterprise vendor in Wisconsin, right? And it's really old, crusty Windows technology. And Jim and I talked about it. We talked about it with a couple other people in the company. And I went to Chester, who ran engineering at the time, and said, hey, if we could do this, they say they'll buy from us and they'll introduce us to 14 more healthcare systems. Well, what the hell else we got going on here that's going to drive growth? We may as well try it. And we thought, okay, it'll take us 3 months to get this implemented. Turned out it was 6 months, which still okay. We didn't have that much
less than
Windows.
I thought.
Yeah. So it was, Duo is pretty simple product when you get down to it. It's just allow access or don't allow access, right? So as part of the login procedure. So And when we closed that, then, that became our first, I think it was our first six-figure deal. It was a big celebration for the company. We'd had, 50K deals prior to that. And then, true to their word, they introduced us to at least a dozen more healthcare systems. And that initiative ended up we went from 0% of our revenue in healthcare to 2 years later, 18%.
Wow.
And this is while we're growing at 150 to 180% year over year for several years. And probably 7 out of our top 10 largest customers were in healthcare. And it was just because we took that initiative to try a new bet. And we realized there was more to build over time to serve doctors and, lock down labs where there's no Wi-Fi and there's no cellular service and stuff like that, because there's medical equipment that you don't want to mess with. But it was really an interesting time for us to pursue growth.
One thing that's very interesting is all the places you've been and all the scaling journeys you've been on, they've actually all been, or at least the ones that I know about, have all been fairly capital efficient. Yes, they may have raised lots of capital, but in terms of that scaling journey, actually, like they almost didn't need that capital. They were doing it efficiently to go with the growth. And I guess, like, in this environment right now, that's something that everybody is struggling with. Because to go to your Epic or Cerner example, right? If you're trying to integrate with that, what would happen now is someone would say, well, heck, that's going to take a whole hell of a lot of time for our team to go and do. Let's go hire a team of 3 engineers to go and do that, right? And then we'll be ready for it. I mean, like, I guess I don't know the right way to ask this question, but just like, how did you get the organizations that you were part of to do all these things without just saying, oh, let's hire somebody else, or we need to hire somebody else, which is now what everyone will say?
Yeah, there is a challenge it's a cultural thing, which is you always think like, well, when I get more resources, I can do more. And what often happens in companies, you add more resources and everything slows down. Like, you're not delivering product at the rate you did earlier on. And so you got to be super careful that every request doesn't end up, anytime you try to do something, it's like, well, we need to go hire more people. It's just the wrong mentality. There's a certain scrappiness that comes with early stage companies that says, hey, we've got 10 engineers or 20, whatever it is, we can figure it out. And as an executive or a manager of engineering, it's better to focus on what can you do with the resources you have, rather than, big company thinking is always like, well, if you need me to do that, I need another team, I need to go hire. And there's a stage at which that makes sense. But early stage companies, like the big competitive advantage that a startup has is it can move fast. Mm-hmm. And if you're not moving fast, you're like just failing to take advantage of the innate strength you have. Like, again, I remember at Zendesk, we'd occasionally run into competitive deals with Salesforce. They'd acquired a crappy company and they had their own crappy help desk stuff. And so we would just be like, hey, we're never going to lose on price to Salesforce. So if you see this, like, we're going to double down and we're going to prove to that customer that we're fast and responsive. And it's going to take 6 levels of approval inside of Salesforce to get a discount. Okay, what's the price you need to get? Okay, we'll do it today, if you sign today. And having that kind of aggressive mentality that says speed is really important to us. Not to the point of being reckless, but you want to move quickly. And sometimes it's more of a mindset of how do we, like, you have to have really good talent. You have to have people who can do the job. And, like the guy who did the Epic integration, he was a pretty good programmer. I'm not saying he was Anders Hausberg. He wasn't like 10x engineer, but he was able to go in and deal with pretty crappy API documentation, test it and figure it out, et cetera. So I think in today's environment, especially, it's super important for companies to get to a path towards cash flow positive and break even. because and the challenge is if you raise money in 2020, 2021, you're not used to that. And it's like you've been binging on Netflix and burgers for 4 years, and now you've got to go run a marathon. Like you're not really equipped to do that. So you really got to figure out what are the most important initiatives in the company, and how do I build up, bottoms up, a budget, staffing, and process to accomplish what must be done to orient the company towards growth. And sales cures all ills. So as people are thinking about initiatives inside the company, you got to stack up everything you're doing and then say, okay, but how do I develop a hypothesis that's going to enable me to grow? Or maybe I've been flatlining and I got to do a step function. It's not about incremental kind of 10, 20% growth. Like my business isn't really doing great and I need it to do great. So you need to do 2 or 3 initiatives and you got to fund those. And not necessarily with massive teams, but maybe a small, like if it's your most important initiative, put your best people on it, and go do 1 or 2 things and then starve the other initiatives. Like maybe this isn't the time, like as you do your planning, like, hey, there's not going to be budget growth for CS next year or whatever group or marketing or whatever. But we have to do this thing. And we have a hypothesis that if we do this, we can get to growth. But what I saw over and over again is companies that are overfunded, they don't have the discipline, and they their idea of efficiency is like, okay, instead of spending 200 grand at a trade show, we'll spend 180 grand. Right. It's like, no, just don't do the trade show. Like you have to think much more radically. And there's a German expression, it's hard to get the pigs to slaughter themselves. Okay. Unfortunately, nobody wants to cut their budget by 90%, but you really have to look carefully at what will drive the company's growth and get out of the incremental, like I got to fund everything, peanut buttering my budget across every department, and everybody gets a little bit, everybody is a little bit incrementally better. Like you got to look for radical ways to improve efficiency. And I was always the guy trying to focus on getting to cash flow positive. And I will say, our metrics at Zendesk were phenomenal. Duo blew Zendesk out of the water.
Yeah. Duos were crazy. Yeah.
The cost of operation, the cost of lead generation, it was just phenomenal. And we used to compare notes with other companies, and it was just when we went to raise money, we'd show it to the investors, and they're like, just jaw dropping. Yeah. And wait, this is a company in Ann Arbor. So we were very proud of the fact that we were able to show the world that, like, hey, you can build $1 billion company out of the Midwest.
Even from the outside perspective, not knowing the numbers very clearly, it was always just known that Duo is capital efficient and growing very quickly. But some founders actually have brought this up where you mentioned you have a hypothesis and go towards that, right? But the challenge is maybe that hypothesis, hey, we have to go in this direction, but we've already built these products here and some people are using it, right? And if we go in this direction, like we're taking on a ton of risk because we've got these customers using us over here, right? But the customers are telling us they will get more use out of this product if we build this thing, right? But it's going to take more time. We're going to have to divert resources away. And so kind of almost, why don't we hedge, right? Let's build that new product and let's go towards that. But also we'll still do our thing over here, right? We'll still have the customers using it, and then we'll roll out this new product once it goes. Like, what advice do you have for founders trying to go through that in terms of, it's risky on both sides, right? If you give it up, you're like you said, you're starving the resources on the current customers, right? But flip side is if that's where you think the market's going and you miss that window, then you're dead pretty much, right? So what do you suggest?
Yeah, you have to play to win. And one of the questions I ask teams is, how will you win? And usually if you shine a light on it, it's pretty clear that staying Like if you have a mediocre offering in a mediocre market with a mediocre product that nobody's super excited about, but you have customers, it's not going to win. You might limp along for a long time, but that's not really an option in startup world. Like if once you've taken venture capital, like it's not really an option, and it's not an option if you're like, how the hell are we going to raise money in a year or whatever you need to if you've got lackluster growth. So for me, what I do is I try to figure out what is necessary. I'll do a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and identify like 2 or 3 hypotheses. What are bets that we can make which can really radically change the company? It might be new product features, might be aiming for a different segment of market. There's all kinds of different things that come into it. Might be just having more salespeople, but ideally based on something that you're seeing at a small scale in your company where you say, if we could do this repeatedly, and then you just have to have the conviction and the willingness to pretty close to burn the boats. Like you have to be willing to say, it's a risk. We're going to take that risk. And we're placing all our bets on this thing. And, okay, maybe it's not going to work, but you have to have that leadership conviction that says this is worth taking. And you got to be able to explain it inside the company so that if people are working on something that's like, maybe there's something you're keeping a skeleton crew on or minimal, you say, hey, I still need to service those customers, and I want you to do the best you can with those customers. It's still important. And maybe you're going to go 6 or 9 months or a year without major functionality there, but you're going to have a little bit. But the worst thing is if you prematurely strangle the new opportunity by trying to serve 2 masters, maintaining the old thing and doing the new thing. And you just got to be bold and take that initiative. And sometimes it's really helpful if you take a step back and you say, what will this look like a year from now? And you're able to convey to your stakeholders, your employees, your managers, your investors, like, hey, this is the bet we're making. These are the things. And then you have to identify the stages or the gates that you're going to get to, and maybe identify for just the execs, like, okay, if we see this thing not working, we're going to take these other actions. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes I see executives they're fearful of making decisions. And you can't make good decisions if you're afraid. You just have to imagine like, what do I need to make happen to increase the likelihood of this succeeding? And if you have a fear, figure out, okay, well, how do I mitigate that likelihood? Maybe you have a fear of positioning, or you have a fear of like the competition is doing something. Like, okay, you got to determine what's in your control and what's not in your control, and then apply the right resources to tackle those problems. And again, it sounds obvious, but if it's your most important initiative, put good people on it. Right. And the way I learned these lessons was at the really tough years at Borland. And I saw executives do the opposite of this. You'd have a product that was, paradox, it was in decline, and it'd be like, okay, well, we're going to do one more release and we hope sales will increase. And it's like, okay, but it's been declining sales. Like, why would it increase now? Like, you're actually better off just saying, hey, we're gonna shut that down, or we're gonna put it in maintenance mode, and we'll still sell it, but we're not hoping for good things, and we're gonna place another strategic bet. And so you need to have people on the executive team who are looking for opportunities to do great things in the market. And Peter Drucker, and I'll credit Martin Mikos for the Peter Drucker influence in my career, but looking for opportunities rather than just problems is a key thing. And if you can identify those things and then validate it in the market, like, don't just sit at the whiteboard and make it up. Go out and talk to customers and prospects and assess the competitive situation and figure out how will you uniquely solve that problem in a way that's better than anyone else out there. And again, if you can do that in the B2B world, like customers will generally pay you for that.
That is, I know a lot of founders are going through that right now that will be replaying that section to continue to learn from. But I want to wrap things up with the last role that you ended up taking, which is the CEO at Gatsby. And this time you're helping out front end developers, right? So again, another switch and a whole nother area. And I was reading on LinkedIn, you mentioned that you came in, you had to rebuild the executive team, and you had to really focus on building operation effectiveness. And I guess a lot of other companies are doing that, as we talked about. They're lapping those COVID excesses, or they're just we went from a excess to now we're in a time of do more with less. And so what tips do you have to kind of go through this rebuilding and operational effectiveness exercise?
Yeah, I'll probably sound like a broken record, but for us at Gatsby, Gatsby was in a difficult situation. It was COVID, it was lockdown, there were Black Lives Matters kind of things going all over, and the company was kind of just slipping away from the founders. And so, they asked me to come and help, and the investors asked me to come and help. So a lot of it was initially like trying to stabilize the organization and listen to all the employees, all the concerns, and then try to identify. And the big challenge we had was we didn't have a sellable product. It was approximately zero revenue coming in. We had a couple small deals, but we had to really reorient and build a product, Gatsby Cloud, and make it into a real competitive offering. And the founders are great, Sam and Kyle. They're off doing new things now, and very creative, very tapped into the developer world. But we had a lot of users out there with open source. Gatsby had been this darling of the front ends for a couple of years. That had started to fade, and what we realized was that it was super valuable for very large content sites, hundreds of thousands of pages, people moving off legacy content management systems like Adobe, sometimes WordPress, Drupal, onto the new headless content stack, Contentful, kind of the more modern era. And so, Ben Robertson, who was head of customer success, he and I, mostly him, he conceived of this new product we called Concierge, which was a service to help people optimize their build times and their Gatsby pages. And we offered this as a service, and I think it was $30K, $50K, something like that, depending on the usage. And I remember in an all hands meeting, somebody put up their hand and they said, "Isn't this Concierge thing some kind of stopgap revenue thing?" And I'm like, yes. Yes,
you nailed
is.
it.
Because we need to build the muscle of how to sell something and learn more about those customers and what it is they're trying to do. And in the process, we saw all kinds of bottlenecks up close in Gatsby, and then had Kyle go fix these things, and we'd get it was sort of a joke internally. I'd say, we need to get 10x faster build times, 10x. And Kyle would get that done, and then another 10x, and eventually, this thing was pretty high scale for very large projects, but it had changed dramatically during that time. And that Concierge offering, the services offering, basically became the precursor to selling enterprise cloud offerings. And I think 50% of the enterprise deals we did later on had some degree of the Concierge service in it. So, again, you got to focus on a couple of initiatives, and this was based on Ben and the sales team's understanding of what customers were running into, and these are customers that they have a big problem, their performance isn't acceptable, and we either fix it or they move off. Mm-hmm. And the good news is in B2B, if you say here's how we can fix it, and it costs you this, they're like, okay, it's just a rational decision, for $50K, we're going to get higher performance. We're using this open source stuff. Great, let's do it. And then they're like, oh, we could host it on your cloud and it's actually faster. Well, let's do that. How much is that? And then we start getting, nice six-figure deals. So I would say, look for the patterns among your customers to find out what are the big high-value opportunities. And then figure out what you can do, product features, service capabilities, salespeople, content, that makes that slightly more repeatable. Look for the things that have the highest return, that ideally they're actually happening today. You can point to 2 or 3 of these and say, there's something happening here in this space with this kind of customer, with this kind of problem. Because if you get good at positioning around a specific use case, it makes sales and marketing that much easier. And it's the mistake a lot of startups make is they can be all things to all people. Like, look, if we needed to, we could go do this, and we could write code to do this, and we could write code to do that. It's just a question of writing code. But the more important thing is to be laser focused, so that when somebody comes to your website, in 10 seconds or less, they know, is this for you or it's not for you? And orient everything around that, and then create campaigns and content and sales process around that specific use case. And founders will often say, well, doesn't that limit me? Yeah, in the short term. But once you're good at doing that repeatable thing, then you can expand to adjacent areas, other vertical markets, other use cases, other integration efforts, and start to build a bigger kind of market for what you're doing. But it's way better that somebody comes to your website and they know immediately, is this the thing I'm looking for or not? Is this, like, what is the problem they have in mind? And who is the potential buyer? What is their problem? And why are you unique at this? And if you can answer those questions, then you have a shot at communicating. And then when in doubt, ask customers. And go to your existing customers, call them up. And we did this all the time. Sam, co-founder of Gatsby, is phenomenal at this. He'd go call them up and he'd ask them, like, so how did you end up picking Gatsby? And they're just like, wow, a founder's calling me and asking me this stuff. And then he'd figure out some things, and then we'd say, okay, there's some things for Kyle, the other technical co-founder, to go work on. And now we can make the product better and improve it. But, getting out and talking to customers is super, super important.
Zack, you are nothing but consistent, as we've heard throughout the whole thing. Customers and talking to customers and getting out in front of them is what makes sense. But we will frankly have to have you on for a part 2, because they are, even just the services piece. You just wrote a piece about that recently. There's a ton more that we can dive into, and many other areas. So we'll have to do that. But for now, thank you so much for sharing the experiences, the anecdotes from your career. And I think it'll be very useful for all the founders and early employees that are listening, because they're all going through this right now.
It's hard. I have a lot of empathy. It's really hard to build a business and scale it. And so I try to be generous in my time to founders and execs and people in startups. And I'm grateful to all the people I worked with at Duo and Zendesk and MySQL and Borland and elsewhere. And I try to capture some of these lessons. So if you want to check it out, it's buildtoscale.substack.com. And sometime in 2024, I hope to take all the best content there and turn that into a book.
Oh, I love it. Love to hear that. And we'll definitely read it for sure, but we will link to it in the show notes. I'm a subscriber. I love reading it. I send it to founders, so I recommend others to do it as well. But Zack, thank you so much for the time, and look forward to when we do part 2.
Cool. Good talking with you.